And now we are in Chapter 4, Radiation Biology. The learning objectives for this chapter include to define the terms associated with radiation injury, describe the mechanisms and theories of radiation injury, define and discuss the dose-response curve and radiation injury, describe the sequence of radiation injury and list the determining factors for radiation injury, discuss the short-term and long-term effects, as well as the stomatic and genetic effects of radiation exposure. You should be able to describe the effects of radiation exposure on cells, tissues, and organs, and identify the relative sensitivity of a given tissue to X radiation, to define the terms of define the units of measurement used in radiation exposure, list common sources of radiation exposure, discuss risk and risk estimates for radiation exposure, discuss dental radiation and exposure risks, and then discuss the risk versus benefit of dental images. Then the purpose of this chapter is going to be to describe the mechanisms and theories of radiation injury. We need to define the basic concepts and effects of radiation exposure. It needs to detail radiation measurements, and we need to discuss the risks of radiation exposure. Okay, so first let me just start off by saying that the very first line of this chapter on page 31 is that all ionizing radiations are harmful and produce biologic changes in living tissues. This includes dental radiation, dental radiography, and so here with radiation injury, we need to understand those mechanisms. We need to understand the theories of what happens in the body once radiation injury occurs. We need to understand the dose response because the dose determines the level of injury, the stochastic and non-stochastic radiation effects, which we'll learn the differences between, the sequence of radiation injury, so what happens in order after the injury occurs, and then the determining factors for radiation injury. All right, so all radiation injury is that, remember in the previous chapters, we talked about what happens when the X-ray photon comes into contact with cells. Either it passes through and has no effect on the cell, or it can be absorbed, or it can turn into scatter. This chapter is going to be all about what happens when that X-ray photon is absorbed and all of its energy is then transmitted to the cell. So it's not all of the X-rays that we send toward the receptor are able to reach the receptor. That's actually a good thing because we want some of them to be absorbed so that we get a proper image. And we need to understand, though, that that absorption causes changes that result in biologic damage. There's two types of injury that occurs. One is ionization, and then the other one is the free radical formation. Ionization is exactly what we talked about in Chapter 2. So when the X-ray strikes the patient's tissues are made up of atoms, and when that happens, it can either produce the photoelectric effect or Compton scatter. When it results in a formation of a positive atom and dislodges that negative electron, then we get that ionization, right? The atom itself becomes the positive ion and the ejected electron becomes the negative ion. This electron then interacts with other atoms within this tissue. Sometimes it gets reabsorbed back into the atom that it was ejected from. Sometimes it gets absorbed by other atoms, and sometimes it knocks electrons off of another atom's electron shell. And so we're going to get more into this. Okay, so that ionization is a part of free radical formation, where they're the two separate types of injuries, ionization and free radical formation. But in free radical formation, that X-ray photon is going to ionize a water molecule. A free radical is an uncharged atom or molecule that exists within a single unpaired electron in its outermost shell. That will probably show up on your boards. A free radical is very reactive and it's very unstable. It's going to cause damage around it. So this is very important. Free radicals is how biological damage truly occurs. So we have The damage to the living tissues, which is caused by exposure to ionizing radiation, can result when have a direct hit and the absorption of an X-ray photon within that cell, or the absorption of an X-ray photon by water within a cell accompanied by free radical formation. So even though free radical formation is ionization, because it is so very specific to water, we are not putting the two together. There is ionization of the cells that are not water, and then there's free radical formation when ionization occurs with water. The two theories of how radiation damages biological tissues is going to be the direct theory and the indirect theory. Okay, so cell damage results when ionizing radiation directly hits critical areas within the cell. This doesn't happen very often, but this happens when the X-ray photon, which is, shooting toward that tissue, and either it ionizes the cell, which it ionizes the atoms within the cell. In disrupting those atoms, it causes an excitation or it breaks those bonds. And then that leads to chemical changes within the cell. And those chemical changes lead to biological changes. Most X-rays will pass through the cell with little or even no damage. So then the indirect theory is that X-ray photons are absorbed within the cell. They cause those free radicals, which form toxins, which within the cell, which damage the cell. And when X-ray photons are absorbed by water within a cell, that's when the free radical formation happens. The free radical combines with other free radicals to form toxins that damage the cell. This occurs actually more frequently than the direct theory because most of cells are made up of water. Human cells are actually 70 to 80% water. So the photon interacting and ionizing the H2O molecule is much more likely than it is to affect the the atoms within the nucleus of the cell. Okay, so here is like a depiction of all of that. The X-ray photon interacts with the water in the cells. So here you can see those X-ray photons are coming down toward these H2O molecules. They break off some of those free electrons, but as you know, H2O doesn't have a ton of free electrons floating around in there. So then ionization happens, and some of those little electrons pop off. And then over here, this little dot next to the H, that is the symbol for a free radical. So the ionization occurs, and then you have all of these free radicals over here. Now, these free radicals, they have to bond with something else very, very quickly. And so sometimes they'll bond with each other, and that will create a toxin, which then causes chemical changes within the cell. Okay, so then here's the rest of that. We just talked about those free radicals, these guys with their little dots next to the letters, they combine. They have to combine really, really quickly. And then when that happens, you have a bunch of H's by themselves and a bunch of OH's by themselves. And so then what they form is H2O2, which is the chemical makeup of hydrogen peroxide. And those H2O2s and the free radicals that are still floating around, those are very harmful to the tissue. Some of the ones that combine back, they'll combine back to H2O, right, which is water. Some of them will just combine to each other, and then these guys, some of them will form hydrogen peroxide. Okay, so those were theories about the harmful effects, those injuries that are created. This goes into the dose response curve, goes into the amount of X radiation that an area is exposed to and how that plays a role. So not only, how many of those X-ray photons that the individual is exposed to in a single setting, but also how often they're being exposed to those X-ray photons and how that plays a role on that living tissue. So here, the first thing I want to say though is that there is no safe amount of radiation exposure. Even a very small amount will cause damage. The dose response curve is a curve that is used to correlate the damage to tissue with the dose of radiation received. The first one we'll do is a linear non-threshold relationship. The linear relationship indicates that the response of the tissues is directly proportional to the dose. The non-threshold dose response curve suggests that no matter how small the amount of radiation received, some biological damage occurs. Okay, so then here we're going to look at the difference between a threshold curve and a linear curve. The threshold curve, you can see this word threshold with this little arrow. This line means that from there is some dose, but up until this point, there is no response in the tissue. And the threshold curve also means that once we get to a certain response, the response will not continue to get greater, even though we may continue to increase the dose, it will stay constant right here. We've seen this S curve quite a bit in the COVID-19 epidemiology graphs that have been showing up on TV lately. And so this means that up until a certain point of people who were getting COVID, they weren't dying from it. And then we hit a certain amount of people who had hit it, and then they started to die. And then eventually we will have enough immunity, or enough of the people who would die from COVID-19 will have already. And then it will continue where even though people will continue to get COVID, they maybe they won't die from it anymore. And that's what that S curve, when you're seeing it in epidemiological studies on the news, that's what that's talking about, flattening that S curve. Also, down here on bottom, we have the linear curve, and that means that no matter how small a dose that is given, there is some response. And so here we're seeing that we know that no matter how small a dose goes, there is some cellular change. That one's going to follow this linear curve. However, we're going to see later that there are certain diseases or certain effects from X radiation exposure that do have a threshold. We have to get to a certain amount of a dose before we start to see those results. Okay, so then here we see that linear non-threshold curve, and here we're mostly looking at, again, that any amount of radiation will cause some response on a cellular level. It may not cause, hair loss or arrhythmia or, maybe leukemia is way over here, but there will be some response on a cellular level that has to do with the dose caused to the cellular change in the tissue. Okay, so then here's the difference between those two. When there is a threshold, that's going to give us a non-stochastic effect. If there is no threshold, then it will give us a stochastic effect. And what we see here with stochastic is that no matter how small of a dose there is, there will be some type of cellular change. And those cellular changes, those free radicals, those can build up and cause something like cancer or genetic mutations. And even at any kind of small response, you're causing those changes to those cells. A non-stochastic or a deterministic effect is going to be one that does have a threshold. And so then the higher the dose, remember our curve, remember here's maybe our threshold. So maybe, up until a certain dose is when we start to see those effects of maybe arrhythmia or loss of hair or cataracts or decreased fertility, things like that. We have to get to a certain amount of a dose before we start to see these specific effects. But we do know that no matter how small a dose on a cellular level, there is some effect. And so those are these types of results. Those cellular changes that we're seeing, no matter how small the dose, those are stochastic. The ones where we have to have a certain amount before we see those effects, those specific diagnoses, those specific conditions, those are the non-stochastic effects. Okay, so then we're going to get into the sequence of radiation injury. And the first one we have here is a latent period. This can be defined as the time that elapses between exposure to ionizing radiation and the appearance of observable clinical signs. The latent period may be short or long, depending on the total dose of radiation received and the amount of time or rate it took to receive that dose. The more radiation received, And the faster the dose rate, the shorter the latent period. And then after the latent period, there's a period of injury occurs. It's a variety of cellular injuries can result, which include cell death, changes in cell function, breaking or clumping of chromosomes, formation of giant cells, cessation of mitotic activity, and abnormal mitotic activity. Okay, so then the last event in the sequence of radiation injury is the recovery period. Not all cellular radiation injuries are permanent. With each radiation exposure, cellular damage is followed by repair. Depending on a number of factors, cells can repair the damage caused by radiation. Most of the damage caused by low-level radiation is repaired within the cells of the body. That could very well be on your board exams. That not all cellular radiation injuries are permanent. However, some of them are not able to be repaired, or maybe there's another dose that occurs before repair can take effect. And so some of those effects of radiation exposure are added and they don't repair themselves. And this leads to a cumulative effect of repeated radiation exposures, which can lead to health problems like cancer, cataract formation, or birth defects. Basically what I want you to take from that is that some of the effects of radiation exposure are additive or cumulative, right? Like a cumulative grade point average. This is a cumulative effect of cellular damage that occurs over time, over repeated exposures. Unrepaired damage accumulates in those tissues. The body never returns to the exact original state. Okay, so then the next stage here is going to be determining factors for radiation injury. There are several factors that are going to play a role in that radiation injury. And those are going to be the total dose, the dose rate, the amount of tissue irradiated, how sensitive those cells are, and the age of the individual receiving that dose. In addition to understanding the mechanisms, theories, and sequence of injury radiation, it's important to recognize the factors that influence radiation injury. Here, also, children are much more susceptible to radiation damage than are adults, which I think is this is a super funny little thing because I love naps now. They are the best. All right, and then here we have listed the radiation effects. They can be short or long-term effects. They can be somatic or genetic effects. They can be radiation effects on cells, or they can be radiation effects on tissues and organs. All right, so the difference between short-term and long-term effects. Short-term effects are associated with large doses of radiation in a short amount of time. This one is associated with acute radiation syndrome, and that includes nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, hair loss, and hemorrhage. Short-term effects occur within minutes, days, or weeks after the exposure. Short-term effects are not applicable to dentistry. We do not give those types of large doses of radiation. Then long-term effects are when small doses are absorbed repeatedly over a long period of time. And here, those effects are seen after years, decades, or even generations after those exposures. Those types of effects include cancer, birth abnormalities, and genetic defects. And while we can't definitively say that dentistry doesn't apply to these long-term effects, we can say that there has been no studies shown that have specifically linked dental x-rays and not other types of medical x-rays to these types of effects. All right, and then another one of the types of effects is going to be the difference between somatic and genetic. Here, it's just about the types of cells that are being irradiated and that are being damaged. So somatic cells are any cell in the body except for the reproductive organs. Pretty easy to get this one. Genetic effects are only the reproductive cells. And it's really important here because if we damage a cell that is not a part of the reproductive organ, then that means that those traits are only going to affect the irradiated person themselves. But if we were to irradiate genetic cells or the reproductive cells, then we would actually be causing changes to the next generation, the offspring of the person who was irradiated. The biologic effects of radiation can be classified as either somatic or genetic. And then here is a depiction of what I was just talking about. So somatic effects are seen in the irradiated person. You can see that the dog on the top here. That dog is being irradiated. And if it is a somatic effect, then we see the little arrow pointing over to this dog. This dog, you can see it looks a little smaller, a little more sickly, right? Because it's had an effect. Whereas if it were a genetic mutation or it was a genetic effect, then it would affect the reproductive organs of this dog, but we wouldn't see that in this dog, the actual dog that was irradiated. We would see it in the next generation, this dog right here. Now, if it is a somatic effect and it affects the individual who was irradiated, but then they go on to have offspring, then the offspring does not have that somatic effect. Okay, there is no genetic mutation here. So the offspring or the reproductive cells were still safe from that X-ray radiation, and so the offspring was not affected. Okay, so then depending on the type of cell that is going to be exposed to radiation is going to determine the effect the radiation has on the cell. So a cell that is sensitive to radiation is termed radiosensitive. One that is resistant to radiation is radioresistant. This seems pretty intuitive. Radiosensitive and radioresistant. The response is determined by a cell's mitotic activity, which is the cells that divide frequently or undergo many divisions over time, are more sensitive. Cells that don't divide frequently are going to be less sensitive. Cell differentiation are cells that are either they're mature and they do not need to continue to create whatever the type of cell it's going to have to be. Like stem cells, for instance, are not highly differentiated yet, and so they are more sensitive to radiation. Whereas cells that are more mature and have already specialized are less sensitive. So cells that are immature or are not highly specialized are more sensitive to radiation. Then we have cell metabolism. And this one is cells that have a higher metabolism are more sensitive to radiation. Okay, so then table 4-2, and that's going to be on page 35. That is a wonderful table at looking at the types of cells that are radiosensitive or radioresistant. Radiosensitive organs will include the lymphoid tissue, bone marrow, testes, and intestines. Testes also include like ovaries, any type of reproductive organ. And then radioresistant tissues are going to be salivary glands, kidneys, and liver. And this is actually the lymphoid tissue is important because there are a lot of head and neck lymph glands, and then the salivary glands are also a part of the head and neck areas that we are exposing to radiation in dentistry. And so it's important to understand the difference here between these types of tissue because you're essentially pointing the X radiation directly at salivary glands almost every single time you take one. All right, and then the radiation effects on tissues and organs. So if an organ is critical, it means that the organ, if it is damaged, will diminish the quality of a person's life. And so maybe while we wouldn't think that the skin is terribly critical, it is. Like if we were to lose our skin or our skin overall were to be less intact, our skin is actually one of the most important organs that we have at protecting us from all types of bacterial infections and viral infections and all of the world around us. The other ones we deal with in dentistry is going to be the thyroid gland. That's why when you guys were in lab last week, you were putting that thyroid collar around your patient's neck. And it's important to get that up nice and close to the patient's neck so that we can protect that thyroid gland from X radiation. The lens of the eye. Now, this isn't something that is in every single one of our radiographs, but it's important because without vision, that would very diminish the individual's quality of life. And then bone marrow as well. So while the bone marrow that is present in the head and neck areas that we take radiographs of there isn't a lot of bone marrow there. There is some. And so we need to be aware of these four types of critical organs that we are exposing to dental radiographs on a daily basis. Okay, so this next portion, the radiation measurements, this one is going to feel a little bit overwhelming. I'm not actually going to ask you to be measuring a lot of these things. We just need to understand that these are measured and that there are measuring tools and units in order to measure these, and that they have a correlation between the types of effects that we see on cells based on dose. And so it's important that we understand how radiation is measured. So then we're going to talk a little bit about older units of radiation measurement and then the newer units of radiation measurement. The older one was called a Roentgen. It was also radiation absorbed dose, and then Roentgen equivalent in man, or REM. And then today we are measuring based on coulombs per kilogram, the gray, and the sievert. And each one of these is correlated to the corresponding one on top. So a Roentgen is correlated with coulombs per kilogram. The radiation absorbed dose, or RAD, is correlated with gray, and the Roentgen equivalent in man, or REM, is correlated with sievert. All right, so then a Roentgen is measured radiation that determines the amount of ionization that occurs in the air. So remember how we talked about how anytime radiation hits matter, it will create ionization. It will um, cause that electron to break away from its chain. Well, air is also matter. And so as those X-ray photons travel through air, they have the potential to collide with those nitrogen and oxygen and hydrogen, all of those air molecules that are, floating around in the air around us. The Roentgen measures how much ionization that occurs in the air that is being exposed. There is no SI equivalent here, like exactly. We don't have one that is perfectly, even like the gray and the sieverts are, but the exposure now is measured in coulombs per kilogram. So then the dose measurement is going to be the amount of energy that is absorbed by tissue. So the traditional unit was the RAD, or radiation absorbed dose. I think that one is like the perfect name for this. It's RAD. The SI equivalent, or the newer version of this, is called the gray, and it's abbreviated GY right there. So 1 gray is equal to 100 rad. And then conversely, 1 rad is equal to 0.01, or 1/100th of grays. The dose equivalent measurement is also going to be to compare the Roentgen equivalent in man, or the REM, with the sievert. And again, we're seeing this pretty evenly balanced. So 1 sievert is equal to 100 REM, and also 1 REM is equal to 1/100th of a sievert. And this is used to compare biologic effects of different kinds of radiation. Okay, so then also on that last side, I wanted to bring up something called the quality factor, or a dimensionless multiplier. And it's used to place all of the different types of exposure effects of all of their different kinds on a common scale. And so when we talk about quality factor, typically we are also talking about those sieverts. Here you can see these charts, and you can see what is being measured, the exposure in air. The traditional unit was the Roentgen. Today's unit is the coulomb per kilogram. The dose is being measured by used to be rad, but now it is gray. The dose equivalent used to be rem, and now it is the sievert. We also want to talk about the quality factor there when we talk about dose equivalent. And then the conversions there for a Röntgen to a coulomb is 1 R is equal to 2.58 times 10 to the negative fourth. And then 1 coulomb per kilogram is equal to 3.88 times 10 to the third Röntgen. Those are probably the most difficult ones, but if you kind of just have an idea of those, you'll probably be able to get through the rest of this course. All right, and then this slide just talks about metric conversions. It's a wonderful, review of metric in that milli means 1/1000th. It's used to express the small doses in dental radiography. And so this chart is wonderful at talking about how, the measurements get bigger, like deca, hecto, and kilo, and then as they get smaller, they are deci, centi, and milli. All right, and then the last part here is going to be talking about radiation risks. So here we're going to be talking about sources of radiation exposure, the risk and risk estimates, the dental radiation and exposure risks, patient exposure and dose, and then the risk versus benefit for dental images. So I hate to tell you this, but every single time you go outside, you are being exposed to natural background radiation. And it's really hard for some individuals to kind of get this concept is that, it's not something that you're only being exposed to in a dental office or in a medical office, but just being outside cosmic radiation from the stars and the sun, and terrestrial radiation, which is radioactive materials that are in the earth, like certain elements of the earth are actually radioactive, and individuals are absorbing that background radiation on a daily basis. Here in the United States, the average dose of background radiation received by an individual ranges from 150 to 300 millirad per year. Or if we look at those in the millisieverts, it is 3.1 millisieverts from natural resources per year. And then also we have artificial or human-made radiation that we are being exposed to on a daily basis, just from living in a world with these types of technologies. And so we have from modern technology, which include consumer products, fallout from atomic weapons, weapons production, and the nuclear fuel cycle. And then also we have medical radiation, which include medical radiographic procedures, dental radiography, fluoroscopy, nuclear medicine, and radiation therapy. By far, the greatest contributor to human-made radiation exposure is going to be medical radiation. Anytime you go and get a medical, like a chest x-ray or a CAT scan, anything like that, where you're being exposed to that type of radiation is going to give you a much larger dose. This chart here shows you kind of the amount of radiation that an individual gets in the United States in a year. This is based on percentages of where all of those are coming from. And so you can see a lot of it is the radon and thuron, which is just in the ground or in around us. There's the cosmic space, which is only 5%. Terrestrial soil is only 3%. Internal it comes from our food and our water sources, and so we are consuming that radiation in our food and water, and then obviously it's internal. Industrial and occupational is actually 0.1%, and this includes individuals who are occupationally employed in industries that have exposure to radiation, like dental hygiene. And then consumer products, things like that. Nuclear medicine, that's going to be like radiation therapy, and then medical procedures like those chest x-rays, and dental x-rays fall into medical procedures as well. Okay, so then here we're talking about risk and risk estimates. Risk estimates suggest that death is more likely to occur from common activities than from dental imaging procedures, and that cancer is much more likely to be unrelated to radiation exposure. The potential risk of dental radiography include inducing a fatal cancer in an individual has been estimated to be 3 in 1 million people. The risk of a person developing a cancer spontaneously is actually much higher, or 3,300 in 1 million. It's actually more likely you have 1 in 1 million chance of having a fatal outcome, basically having an accident where you die when you ride 10 miles on a bicycle, 1 in 1 million when you do 300 miles in an automobile, 1 in 1 million when you fly 1,000 miles in an airplane, or 1 in 1 million when you're smoking 1.4 cigarettes per day. This is just epidemiological studies that have shown how people die and basically based on the number of exposures that they have to the world around them. And so you're actually much more likely to die just in 300 miles from a regular car than you are from flying in an airplane. So think about that the next time you're flying somewhere. All right, so this slide goes into dental radiation and the exposure risks. So remember we talked about the 4 types of more critical organs that we are exposing when we do dental radiography on individuals. The risk estimates suggest that death is more likely. Oh no, that was from the last slide. Anyway, so here for the thyroid gland, we would need 6,000 millirad or zero point zero 0.06 gray to produce cancer, which we will not get anywhere near that in dental imaging. For bone marrow, we would need zero point zero 0.05 gray to produce leukemia, nowhere near that in dental radiography. Skin, we would need 2.5 gray over only a period of 14 days to produce arrhythma. And arrhythma, once you guys get to that certain section in your dental anatomy and things like that, that's actually just a reddening of your skin. So it would take 2.5 gray, which being exposed to that only over a 14-day period to produce arrhythma. And then for the eyes, you would need 2 grays to induce cataracts. And so none of these are the amount that is being exposed to individuals. I think one of them is like 5,000 or 500 radiographs that you would have to take. um, yeah, oh, so for the skin one, for the 250 rad or the 2.5 gray in a 14-day period, you would have to take more than 500 dental films over a period of 14 days in order to be exposed to that amount of gray, which would produce arrhythma. And so I don't know anyone who gets 500 dental films, and that's at F speed, which is we'll find out later is actually a lot more radiation than what we are doing in our clinic with digital radiographs. All right, and then patient exposure and dose. So here we're talking about the different types of things that we do in the dental office to reduce that patient exposures and the patient's dose. And so the 3 main things that I really want you to take from this is that it's the receptor choice, which is the difference between, that F speed or D speed film and the digital radiographs. The collimation, which we'll go into more, but a rectangular collimation is actually um, somewhere between 60 to 70% less radiation that gets absorbed by the individual than if we were using round collimation. And then technique has to do with the type of technique that we're using to take the radiographs. So either we're using paralleling versus maybe occlusal films or panoramic films, things like that. And then also with technique, we need to look at the skill of the radiographer. So if the individual is having to take retakes on a patient, then we're not saving our patient that exposure and that dose. We're actually so the better you are at taking those radiographs, and the more that we pay attention to where to place the film and how to place the tube head, the less radiation that you'll be exposing your patients to. Okay, so then risk versus benefit of dental images. And we need to remember that X radiation, no matter how small, is harmful to living tissues. So does the benefit of diagnosing dental disease outweigh the risk associated with dental radiation? Here, dental images should only be prescribed for a patient when the benefit of disease detection outweighs the risk of biological damage. So when dental images are properly prescribed and exposed, the benefit of disease detection far outweighs the risk of damage. All right, that's it for this one. Please, please, please write those questions in the question and answer discussion board if you have them, or save them for when I see you on Tuesday or Thursday in your lab. And you can always send me an email if you need to know more. Thank you.